In this lecture, we will be examining the causes and major events leading up to the War of 1812, which is sometimes called the Second American War of Independence. The backdrop to the War of 1812 is a period of warfare in Europe. From 1793 to 1815, Britain and France were almost continuously at war with each other. These wars have been grouped into the Revolutionary Wars, which run from about 1792 to 1799, and the Napoleonic Wars, which run to 1815. As part of its so-called continental system, France began a continent-wide embargo against British trade, a policy that began in November of 1806. The British retaliated by using their formidable navy to blockade European coasts. This indirectly dragged the United States into the conflict, as American trade was strong with Britain, France, and other European powers at this time. Both the French and the British tried to persuade the U.S. to embargo the other nation, and President Jefferson initially attempted to stay neutral. By 1807, British vessels had seized more than 1,000 American ships, confiscating valuable cargoes. The British justification was that American vessels were resupplying an enemy of Britain, namely France. France at this time seized hundreds of U.S. ships under the same pretext. The issue of impressment is another contributory cause to the outbreak of the War of 1812. The term impressment refers to the act of taking sailors into a navy by force and without prior notice. It's kind of like a draft, except you don't have a draft card and a draft board. You're just hogtied and thrown on a ship. American public opinion turned sharply against the British due to this policy of impressment. British vessels would seize American citizens from U.S.-flagged ships and force them into service with the British Navy. The war with France left the British with severe shortages of experienced sailors. The British justified this policy by claiming that these were really British citizens, these impressed men, since the sailors were born when the colonies were still British territory. However, many impressed sailors had been born after 1783, the end of the Revolutionary War. One of these attempts to impress sailors led to a significant conflict known as the Chesapeake-Leopold Affair. In June 1807, the commander of a British warship named the Leopold attempted to board and search a U.S. naval frigate named the Chesapeake. They were in search of British deserters. When the American captain refused to allow his vessel to be boarded, the Leopold opened fire on the Chesapeake. 3 American sailors were killed, another 18 Americans were wounded. This incident angered many Americans, many of whom demanded revenge for this attack. In response, President Jefferson pushed for and managed to get passed a piece of legislation known as the Embargo Act of 1807. Jefferson thought that the loss of U.S. trade goods would punish Britain and other European powers, ultimately convincing them to honor American neutrality. This law essentially closed American ports to outside trade, which seems mind-bogglingly dense these days, knowing what we know about economics. It did not have its intended effect of punishing the British and the French. The law seriously harmed the U.S. economy, and Congress ultimately ended this embargo in 1809. The next president, James Madison, continued to have to deal with this ongoing conflict between the British and the French. When Madison became president, he pushed for legislation called the Non-Intercourse Act, which reopened trade with all nations except for Great Britain and France. That law expired in 1810, and Congress passed a bill known as Macon's Bill No. 2. This bill did further reopen trade, but gave the president the power to prohibit commerce if a foreign nation continued to be belligerent. Seizing the opportunity, Napoleon and the French ceased hostile actions, so Madison only placed the embargo on Great Britain per the terms of Macon's Bill No. 2. Conflict with Native Americans is another contributory cause to the War of 1812. As we have discussed in earlier lectures, British had been still present in some of the territories that wound up in the possession of the United States after the Revolutionary War, especially in what was known as the Ohio Country, so parts of modern-day Ohio, Michigan, Indiana. Shawnee Chief Tecumseh began organizing Native American groups against further white expansion in the Old Northwest. The Old Northwest, again, being that region around the Great Lakes. In 1811, Tecumseh's brother Tenskwatawa and allied Indian groups were defeated at the Battle of Tippecanoe by military forces led by the governor of Illinois, William Henry Harrison. A source of agitation for the Americans was news that Native Americans had been fighting with arms supplied by British merchants. A group of American politicians known as the War Hawks began pushing for war with Great Britain. The War Hawks in general were a group of Southern and Western congressmen who called for war with Great Britain. They tended to be younger, as opposed to the Federalists, who were a little bit older as a group. There was no official listing of this faction, and scholars today still debate whether the term can be used to describe many politicians of the time period as we look back, because supporters of the war did not self-identify that way. In fact, it was something of a pejorative. In general, War Hawks wanted an invasion of British Canada to punish the British and to end the threat from Native American groups being supplied arms and other supplies by British merchants. An underlying agenda for the War Hawks, I should add too, would be territorial expansion, both from lands cleared of Native Americans and the possibility of adding territory from Canada to the United States, should the United States be victorious. Madison was elected in 1808 as a Democratic Republican from Virginia. By 1812, Madison had decided that the U.S. needed to go to war with Great Britain. He was rather reluctant. He was one of the early opponents of war. Madison argued that Britain was trying to strangle American trade and cripple the American economy. He faced significant domestic political pressure, however, to go to war from the War Hawks faction, while anti-war factions were not able to summon much opposition. Congress approved the war declaration early in June of 1812.